Okay, Gabriel, we are now live. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really glad you could be with us today. We've got something we're really looking forward to in the next hour or so. My name is Gabriel Brymer. I'm a claims executive at Marsh. I've also recently joined the ICANN steering committee as the BLM lead. Please get in touch with me, that would be great. That would like you to participate on. It's on sli.dou. That's the website you'll see behind on the screen. If you could also use the code #11812, put your answers in there, please. We would like that to be completed before David joins us today. Just a little bit on today. Within 2020, there's probably a lot of reasons why we don't really want to look back on, but it has been an incredibly intense year. We've had COVID, we've had lockdown, the FCA announcements, we've had George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and of course we had diving festivals as well. But this year, the Black History Month seems to be more important than ever. This month, across the industry, we've seen so many initiatives, activities, educational resources and imaginative resources from all organisations across, trying to educate their staff, also re-educate their staff and employees and themselves on the importance of Black History Month and why it's celebrated in the UK and across the world. But this is the event which is most focused on where we have come from and how we can move forward as Black professionals within the insurance industry. I'm absolutely thrilled to have the well-renowned Professor David Oluso with us today, and with our brilliant panel of senior insurance leaders and insiders, Chris Khan from Convex and Marcia McFarlane from Marsh, and also Rose St. Louis from KPMG. Some of you may know her from Zurich, her time at Zurich. Despite all being under the age of 21, collectively, between them, they have over 50 years of lived experience in the insurance market, especially as a person of colour. That is invaluable to a young professional like myself, and I'm pretty sure to most of the people listening today, you're really looking forward to hear their perspective on how the insurance market is doing, how we can do better, and obviously what we can do to improve. I want to also make a special thanks to our sponsors and our fantastic team at Convex, Stephen Catlin and Paul Brand, for collaborating with ICANN to recognise the importance and relevance of Black History Month for those working, breathing and living, hoping to progress within the insurance industry, just like all of you today. We all want to see a brighter future, and we all want to see a brighter and, more importantly, an inclusive future for our industry and for the ones who are going to come after us. However, obviously Black History Month isn't just in October, as you guys all know. It goes all year round. There's so much more initiatives that will be planned throughout the year, throughout the rest of the year, lockdown or not, and obviously going into 2021 as well. So please stay tuned and obviously find out what initiatives we are doing so you guys get yourself involved. But I think before we can understand the future and before we can understand where we want to get to, we need to obviously understand where we've come from and learn from those histories and learn from some of those mistakes, learn our identity and the relevance of those decisions and how we can learn from them to go forward and impact the insurance market in a more diverse and equal way. So without further ado, I welcome Professor David Oluso to take the mic or the Zoom. Over to you, David. Please give us a reality check on our past. Take us to school.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for marking Black History Month. I mean, we find ourselves this year in a very different Black History Month than the ones of the previous 2 years, because both the Black History Months of 2018 and 2019 existed under the shadow of the Windrush scandal. Now, the Lessons Learned review, led by Wendy Williams, into that scandal, one of its findings was that people in the Home Office had trapped members of the Caribbean community, people who'd been in Britain for 50 years, sometimes longer, people who'd left Barbados, Jamaica, Guyana when they were children and had almost no memories of those islands, people who had left those nations when they were not nations, when they were part of the British Empire, people who were not immigrants, but travelers within an empire that they had the right to travel in, that they had been caught in an immigration system, in part because the people in the Home Office just didn't know their history. They didn't understand the stories of how people from the Caribbean and people from Africa and India came to Britain in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, how British companies invited them, London Transport, the National Health Service, the Hotel and Restaurants Association, invited people, recruited people, opened recruiting offices in Barbados, in Jamaica, to bring people to Britain. They didn't understand that those islands had been part of England and then Britain's sphere of influence since the 17th century. None of that was properly understood because we don't understand our history. And if we don't understand our history, the history of empire, the history of slavery, we don't understand the backstories and the family stories of one another. Now, this has been a remarkable year. I think if you want to work out and try to calibrate just how remarkable it's been, I think there's a really interesting thought exercise that we can engage in. If you try to imagine yourself back to the beginning of this year and try not to think about the coronavirus and everything that's going to come, but just think about what you might have imagined would have been possible in 2020 in terms of progress that might be realistically made in our society with regards to its relationship, its long, difficult relationship with race and racism, with ideas of inferiority and supremacy, with ideas of diversity and inclusion. What were our best hopes for 2020? I think if you put yourself back to that position in January 2020 and imagine what progress, how far down the road you imagined we could get, you realize something quite remarkable has happened. If somebody had told me in January 2020 that by the summer, there would be week after week after week in which half the books in the bestseller lists were books on race or Black history, that Rennie Ada Lodge would become the first Black British woman to become the #1 bestseller, I would have said they were dreaming. If somebody had told me in January 2020 that across the world, millions of people, most of them young, would use their social networks and their social media feeds to organize thousands of demonstrations across the world in the name of anti-racism, I would have said that sounded ridiculous. If somebody had told me in January 2020 that the statue of the 17th century slave trader Edward Colston that had stood in the center of Bristol, the city I'm talking to you from today, for 125 years, defended by organizations created 300 years ago, if someone had told me that statue would be toppled, and then it would be symbolically thrown into Bristol Harbour, the harbour from which over 2,000 slave trade expeditions left, carrying 500,000 people into slavery. If someone had said that that would happen in 2020, I would have not believed them. None of that was predicted. None of it was predictable. And yet this is what has happened in 2020. It's been a year of profound change. There's lots of reasons we might speculate for this. There has to be some connection between what's happened in our capacity to hear the voices of Black people talking about race and their experiences. There has to be a connection to the pandemic. The pandemic did a couple of things. I think it gave people, white people, who may have really wanted to understand these issues better, may have realized that they didn't have a proper grasp on what was being talked about when these ideas of structural racism and anti-racism were mentioned. It gave them the time to think, and they were among the hundreds of thousands of people who bought books and read them this summer. I think that's important. But the pandemic did something else. It took the older generation off the streets and it handed the streets over to the young, and the young used the street for its traditional function as an arena of protest, and they protest about the things that matter to them. So 2020, the year of Black Lives Matter, the year of COVID, was also the year when this generation found its voice and came of age and were noticed for the first time. And there's a few things that this generation is fixated on, that sees as its generational mission to change. One of them is climate change. The other is equality, whether sexual, gender, or race. This is a generation who are determined not to live in a society in which their friends, their colleagues, their family members have their lives and life chances determined by the color of their skin. They're absolutely determined to bring about those changes in a way that my generation just wasn't. But they're also aware of something. They're aware that what they're taught at school reflects the general attitude we have in this country to our history. It misses out the difficult stuff. They're aware that the curriculum doesn't tell them the parts of British history that we have surgically removed from our national story. There are 59 GCSE history modules taught available from the 3 major exam boards in the UK, and only 12 of them have any form of Black history. And in some of them, the Black history on offer is African American history. That means around 10, 11% of students studying history at GCSE get any sort of Black British history. And all that is, as I said, is a reflection of the fact that we don't want to discuss these bits of history. We don't want to talk about slavery. We don't want to talk about violence, the violence of empire. We don't want to talk about the East India Company. We don't want to talk about the wealth that flowed into Britain from these epochs of the past. And the problem there is that those chapters of the past that we don't want to talk about, they're exactly the chapters that explain the backstories and the family histories of Black and brown people. The bits that we've edited out of our history are the bits we need to know to understand how we all came to be here. And it's just as important for the white kids in schools to understand those histories, because it explains to them why their class looks the way it does, why their school looks the way it does, while their city or their football team and their country looks the way it does. Without these histories, our stories, the pathways that led us together to be the country that we are left untold. And that's damaging and it's dangerous. But there's another reason why we should resist the form of history that has become established in this country as what we think of as mainstream British history. If you don't tell the histories of empire and slavery, if you don't tell the parts of the British story that Britain impacted and collided with the lives of people of African heritage, what you also miss out is the development of the idea of race, the idea that we are dealing with, the idea that we in the 21st century, that it falls to us to try to draw out of our societies. And I think what that means is we don't understand the power of the idea of race. We don't understand how potent it is. Race is one of the most powerful ideas ever created, and it was created. One of the reasons why the phrase that was landed in the minds of millions of people in 2020, structural racism, one of the reasons why that's the appropriate, the apposite phrase, is because as an historian, what I would say is, of course, racism is structural. It is structural because it was constructed. It was built. It didn't come about by accident. It didn't evolve of its own volition. It was made. It was made to justify the creation of a new type of society, societies built on slavery with skin color, black and white, as the demarker between who was free and who was a slave, who was human under the law, under conventions, and who was seen to be less than human. That idea, that concept of black inferiority was needed to justify slavery, to justify an idea as strange, as unnatural, as deciding that other human beings, men, women, and children right in front of you are not people and can be treated and beat and punished and whipped. It needs a powerful idea. It needs a powerful idea to convince people on plantations doing terrible things, people on slave ships doing appalling things. It needs a very powerful idea to convince them that what they are doing is justified. And that is what race is. It is one of the most powerful and dangerous and toxic ideas human minds have ever concocted. And it wasn't just built in the slave plantations, in the Caribbean, in the Americas. It was built here in Britain when slavery and the slave system and the slave trade came under attack. The most powerful political lobby the country had ever seen rushed to its defense. First, they said, we can't give up on slavery because the economy would collapse. Slavery, they said, was too big to fail. When that didn't work, they said that slavery was justified because of the nature of Africans. They created the stereotypes that we live with today, the stereotypes that black people are naturally violent and savage. That was used to justify the violence of the slave trade and slavery. They said black people didn't feel pain as acutely as white people. Corrupted doctors said that They had witnessed black people being operated on surgically without anesthetic because they didn't feel pain. But they also created another set of ideas about black simplicity, black intellectual inferiority, that black people lacked the desire for freedom because they lacked the higher faculties of the minds. And these ideas, invented by men who've been in their graves for 2 centuries, are still in our society because they were pumped into the minds of our ancestors through one of the greatest acts of propagandization ever. This lobby could afford the best writers. It could print millions of pamphlets. It could pour its ideas into popular culture, into theatre, into music, into song, into minstrelsy, one of the most toxic forms of art ever created. They could hire the best cartoonists of the day, celebrated figures like George Cruikshanks, to give physical form to the distorted images of Africans they've invented to justify the continuation of their deadly industries. For generation after generation, these ideas were embedded into our society, into the structures of our society, into our own subconscious. And now, in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, we began to fight against those ideas, but we're trying to fight against an idea that we don't fully understand because we've decided to amputate from our national story the chapters of our past that explain where that idea came from and what it was used to justify. One of 2 things can be possible. Either Britain is the only country ever to only have done good things, to have always been on the right side of history, always on the side of angels, and therefore we are the luckiest people to ever live to be citizens of such a country. Or Britain is the same as every country that's ever existed. It's done some good things and it's done some bad things. Which of those two scenarios is the most likely? What 2020's done is it's given us new tools, new ideas. They were already there, but they weren't in popular discourse. Many people had never heard of them. The idea that racism is structural. The idea that we need to be actively anti-racist rather than just passively unracist. The idea that the task of drawing the poison of racism out of our society is not the task of black people alone, but it is the task of all of us through allyship. These ideas have become present in the minds of millions of people this year in a way that no one predicted. The conversations around race have suddenly changed. It's like it's been a sci-fi film and we pressed warp speed and we find ourselves thrust forward thousands of miles. But we're still a long way from our destination. We've made incredible progress this year. We've told new stories about ourselves, unimaginably difficult and complex conversations that we've avoided studiously for decade after decade have begun to be had in 2020. Black people and white people who've known each other for decades have had conversations that they've never thought about having. White people have learned things about their black friends and co-workers, about racism in their lives, how it's shaped their lives. New understandings, new empathies and sympathies have developed in 2020, and new intellectual tools have been put in our hands to fight against race. But we need to remember what our history at school, what the history that we tell one another's, the accepted official history of this country doesn't tell us that we are up against one of the most powerful ideas ever created. And it will take us decades, and it will take us huge amounts of effort, collectively, all together, to undo an idea that was built with huge amounts of money and effort over centuries. And yet, any idea that's created by human beings can be undone. Anything that's constructed can be deconstructed. So there is positive news. The idea of structural racism has within it an optimism. Structures can be deconstructed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, I mean, I need to take a little pause after that. That was really, really powerful. So thank you so much, Professor David Olusoga. I think I've said that right. That was really, really powerful. I've led into a conversation about race a lot more recently, as our panelists have done. But there are a couple of things that I just wanted to pick up. So many things, but just a couple of things where you started and talked about the history, just really chimed with my parents. My dad came to work for London Underground. My mum came to work in the NHS. That's not dissimilar to a lot of people who'll be listening to this, and the lessons that they taught us. I think also the observation around the pandemic and how the older generation and the younger generation have stepped into this conversation and the platforms that they've used to give rise to this conversation. I think that's really, really powerful. And also race as a powerful, dangerous, purposefully constructed idea, and what's been constructed can be deconstructed. And that's how you ended. And I think that was brilliant. So I'm going to invite you onto our panel, David, and thank you for staying with us for the panel. But before we go into the panel, I believe there was a poll that was taken. Do we need to flip the results of the poll up onto the screen?
I'm sorry, I actually won't be able to do that, but I'll just tell you what the question was so everyone can hear it.
Okay.
So the question was, over 17 million men, women and children were enslaved as part of the transatlantic slave trade. What percentage of the London marine insurance business, e.g. cargo, was accounted for by slave trade? And we had a few people vote. The answers were multiple choice, so you could have gone for a quarter, a third, or over 40%. And we have 33, a third conveniently voted for a third, and then 67, so 2/3 voted for over 40, which was the correct answer.
Okay, thank you. Are we going to do the next poll now, or do you want me to move into the panel?
Yeah, so I'll put the next poll up live. So just as a reminder, if people want to participate in the poll, you need to pop over to Slido, that's slide.do, and put in the code 11812, and that should allow you to participate in the poll.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel. As you've already heard from the wonderful David, he's going to be joining us on the panel. But we've also got Chris Khan, who is Group Head of Internal Audit at Convex. And Convex, as you know, they're sponsoring this event today and working in partnership with ICANN. So welcome, Chris. And we've also got Marcia McFarland, Senior Vice President at Marsh. And so you're very welcome. And I will tell you a little bit of a story of a conversation I had with Marcia. She's probably cringing now as I'm saying this. But we know as Black people that work in insurance, we kind of know everyone. And I said, Marcia, where have you been? I've never seen you. And she said, oh, I've just been beavering away and working really hard for the last 30 years. And isn't it interesting thinking about what David said earlier, how it's almost like society wants to hear about our lived experiences. They want to understand us as a race and as a people. So stepping into this virtual platform we've created today for you to share some of that and give our view is really important. I also want to say before we get into the panel, as a Black person working in insurance, when you're asked to speak about race, you kind of feel like it's a little bit of career and brand suicide when you say yes to doing this, because you're not really sure how it's going to land and who wants to hear about it. But people do want to hear about it. Thank you, everyone, for finding the courage and the bravery to put yourself on this virtual platform. And you are well supported and your courage is appreciated by everyone who is on the panel with you, and indeed everyone who is virtually listening to you today. So thank you. Okay, we are going to crack on with the questions. Oh, and sorry, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm Rose St. Louis. I work in insurance, have done for 25 years. I've worked for insurance companies like Legal & General, most recently Zurich, before joining KPMG as a director in their insurance practice earlier on at the beginning of this year. So that's me. So we're going to go with some questions. Unfortunately, because we've got limited time, we are just going to keep the questions amongst the panel. We can't go to the floor, but we've got some great questions and I'm sure some fantastic insights that we want to share with you. And the first question I'm going to open up to everyone, and I'll kind of like direct who I'd like to answer in order, but I'll go with it. So several insurers have spoken out about the murder of George Floyd and confirmed their support for Black Lives Matter. However, is this just rhetoric? What actions and commitments have you seen from insurers which show an ongoing support for Black colleagues? And Chris, if I may, I'd like to come to you first.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Rose. Let me start by saying that the death of George Floyd was a terrible thing and should never have happened. I think I won't speak for what other insurers are doing, but rather I'll share my views on what Convex has done and what Convex is doing. I guess one of the things that attracts me to Convex is that being a new company, they have the opportunity to do things differently. Some of its values talk about enjoy being different, being straightforward and fair, and earn our reputation. So what Convex has done, they've produced a very thoughtful and considered belonging statement. It is endorsed by the company leaders, Paul and Stephen, and has been shared with all staff. It promotes a culture of belonging and ensures that a genuine feeling that it's okay to bring your whole self to work. So what does it actually cover? It talks about how important diversity and inclusion needs to be for Convex to be its best. It also talks about what makes Convex special is the different cultures, the perspectives, and the experiences. It promotes a culture of respect and dignity and actively challenges discrimination should it ever occur. And I think importantly, in addition to this, Convex recruits talent regardless of your background. I mean, this is actively supported by a blind CV screening process. This helps make the playing field more level and gives everyone the chance to actually be seen and given the opportunity. I understand that not many companies at the moment actually do this. Convex is also exploring scholarships in schools and providing insights days for students into the insurance world. I think a lot of people in the schooling environment, the future generation, don't really understand insurance. It's not very widely understood, etc. And Convex seeks to change that. Another example is for a recent intern program. Advertising was very intentional and targeted. And as a result, we had 50% of the interns came from a BAME background. And I guess the last two things I'll mention is obviously we are active sponsors for some of the Lloyd's partner networks, and more specifically ICANN that's hosting this event today. And at Convex, we've also created a group called Convex Allies. And basically it's represented by what we call Convexians. And they look at ways of making a positive difference throughout the organization. And there's a lot of initiatives that are discussed and put forward. So that's just to touch on some of the things that are happening in the insurance industry.
Great, thanks, Chris. Marcia, can you kind of like give us your view of, you know, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and what you're seeing from your view of the world? Oh, do you want to take yourself off mute?
Sorry. Hi. Yeah, so in answer to your question, Rose, I don't believe that the action by insurers and brokers is a case of rhetoric. I think the death of George Floyd shocked everybody. I think you'd have to be extremely insensitive to have not felt disgusted by and saddened by the racism and extreme disregard that those officers had for a human being. George Floyd's death was a catalyst for change for everybody. Sadly for Black people, it was yet again another death in police custody, which we've been reading about for years. However, George's death was poignant, and in particular for Black people. And sadly, a man had to die publicly for us to become visible. The world has witnessed how Black people are often viewed negatively, treated unfairly, marginalized, and treated inhumanely. This triggered everybody, and organizations have reacted and have stepped up to not only review their own behaviors, but those of their organizations, and it's pushed them to make affirmative action to move the dial towards fairer treatment of Black people. In my opinion, the insurance and the financial sector as a whole have responded positively, making statements which in effect say, we are part of the problem and we must do better. The insurance sector is not diverse, and I think that's pretty well known, and recognizing that it's a huge step and something I never thought that I would ever witness, having been in insurance for 30 years. So as with many other insurance companies and brokers, Marsh in the UK are also on the same journey, supported by a multicultural network of which Gabriel is also a member. We have senior leadership support, and we're in the process of gathering data to understand our own ethnic diversity. Also, just to show further commitment, we are hosting a client event, I think in the next few weeks, on Black, just around the Black History Month discussions to discuss topics such as the lack of ethnic minority representation on the board and at C-suite level, and the impact that this has. I think the broking sector in particular needs to be really mindful that our clients are probably going to be, possibly could be, a lot more diverse than what we are. And therefore, we have to show and evidence that we're making positive steps. And I just think it's important that all insurers and brokers maintain all of the bold statements and promises that they've made earlier on in the year. Time will tell, and I think we are just at the first hurdle now.
Thanks for that. I think it's so important, the recognition of like our customers and our clients. You know, they're looking, right, especially against a backdrop of social responsibility and ESG, they're looking to understand our sense of purpose and how that manifests itself. So that's really good. And I'm glad that we're seeing insurance step in to this difficult conversation. You know, I've been really heartened by seeing that. But equally, as a woman of colour in the death of George Floyd, I was sorely disappointed that it took people time to find their feet and respond. And I think it just exposed us as a sector to the fact that, you know, our D&I policies don't cover this stuff. You know, our humanity and who we are and how we think. But I'm so glad that this is a conversation that's been tabled. KPMG, like others, we have a reverse Black Heritage mentoring program that's in its 3rd year and all that kind of good stuff. And I think the activities that insurers are doing is really, really great. I'm going to give this question to you, David, in a bit of a different angle. So obviously how insurers are dealing with this, you might not have intimate detail, but obviously from your view of the world and where you sit, and if you look at maybe financial services and maybe corporate industry, what do you see? Tell us about ourselves from your view of the world.
From what I know of your sector, and you know, I work with lots of companies and I speak with lots of companies, and I mean, what I hear from insurance is the same 2 words that I hear across British the corporate culture, which is discussions. The discussions that weren't happening are happening, and from leadership, this kind of strong sense, which I think is really important, that we're on a journey. Now, a lot of companies feel, and a lot of employees in companies feel, the first steps on that journey were often not as sure-footed as they should have been. I think a lot of people remember what they felt, not what they thought, but what they felt when they saw that film. 8 minutes, 46 seconds, the public murder of a black man on the streets of America. For those who watched that film or tried to watch that film, that feeling of urgency is incredibly strong. And there was a huge amount of frustration in every sector that some people in power didn't feel that urgency as acutely as people who, especially black people who watched that film, did, and allies of black people did. And I think that's across British corporate culture. But I think there has been a kind of sea change since then. I think there are multiple sectors where people have got it, maybe a bit late, but they've got it. They've got 2 things, that it's painful and difficult and it involves discussions we've avoided for a long time, but they've got something else that it's going to take a while. And it's difficult. The thing that I worry about is when organizations or whole sectors start saying the problem is the pipeline, the problem is the education system, the problem is people not applying. That is part of the problem. And that's not within your power. But something cannot be your fault, but it's still your problem. Because if your sector, your company, if it doesn't reflect the country that we're in, if it is a place that unwittingly, despite the best efforts of people in power, repels or rejects or can't find a way of recognizing the talents and the abilities of people from one community or another community, then that is structural racism. And if we identify it, if we see that our cultures, even if we don't understand how it's working, what the mechanism is, what the active ingredients, what the problem is, it's still our problem. And I think being anti-racist is an activity, and it demands proactivity. I'm seeing this more and more. I mean, Chris mentioned intern schemes across multiple industries. I was talking to people in banking yesterday. There's huge amounts of networking between D&I officers and between companies to build intern schemes for a huge net to be cast through the British university system to catch the people who otherwise might not have made it, who don't have the polished social skills and soft skills of people whose parents could pay £30,000 a year to send them to a private school. This proactivity, I think, is just beginning, and that's what mustn't stop. It's not about doing a one-year initiative. It's not about having a special intake. It's about fundamentally making recruitment and making assessment and advancement, an activity that accepts the reality of structural racism, that cultures need to change. Contacts need to be made. Communities who've not felt able to access and advance need to be reached out to. It is not about passively saying, we will make these changes and we will make the door easier to open. We need to go and get people and take them by the hand and guide them into the door. So when I'm impressed, when I'm come away from an organization feeling that 2020, the spirit of 2020, if you want to call it, has been grasped, it's when I hear about proactive rather than passive action. It's about what you're doing to get out there rather than what you're just doing inside. So I see a huge range, but I think, as I said at the beginning, I see conversations and decisions being made that I didn't expect to be made in 2020. And we mustn't allow ourselves to be so pleased and surprised by what's happening that we decide it's enough. But we also need to recognize that this is difficult for everybody. This is challenging for everybody. That's
great. So, you know, keep the discussions going, make sure they turn into action, and also keep the momentum. So this is great. We've just done the first question. I mean, we've got loads more to go here. This is great. So I'm going to my next question, and this one, I'm going to keep you on the floor, as it will, David. So in your latest book, Black and British, you mentioned that for Romans, skin colour did not determine your place in society. However, in modern day society, many may argue that skin colour can determine one's place in society. Skin colour can represent an obstacle or barrier that many to many in ascending to the same opportunities as their white peers. So what lessons can we learn from history to assist us in achieving greater equality, especially in the workplace?
Great. Yeah. Well, the first thing to say about the Romans is they were absolutely horrible in almost every other way. They lived in extremely class-dominated societies. The aristocracy bullied the rest of society. The emperors wiped away the age of the republics and became tyrants and dictators. They were capable of all sorts of forms of prejudice. They were just appalling. And the idea that Rome was a nice place is not the impression I want to give. But they just didn't have the ideas that were born centuries later in the 17th, 18th centuries about black inferiority. They were really quick to decide people who weren't Roman were useless and stupid and should be ignored and didn't have any rights. But they just didn't divide it along skin color lines. And one of the significances, one of the values of history is understanding that this is an idea and there was a time before it reinforces the idea that it's man-made, it was constructed. And racism is not the same as prejudice. Racism is not the same as groups deciding they don't like each other or one group trying to dominate another group. That's the human nature. That's always been there in history. Race is using a demarker of skin color to create values of hierarchies of inferiority and superiority. Now, we don't look at people and judge them by their height and their strength, and that would be weird. We don't look at people's eye color and make those decisions. But because the idea of using skin color has been normalized as a way of dividing people along with gender, we almost don't notice it. The most powerful ideas are ideas that we forget are ideas. And one of the ways of reminding ourselves that they are ideas is to look back in the past at the times before they were created. That's why looking at the Romans and other societies is valuable.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna go back to you now, Chris, if I may, with our next question. So in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, the insurance market as a collective is now coming forward and expressing regret for the roles played in the slave trade. What more should the insurance market do to atone for the part played during this period of history? What do you think?
Thank you, Rose. So I think I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's probably, I'll be brave enough and share maybe 3 life examples that I have that I can share. So I'm of a mixed race background. And when I was growing up, there was always table talk from my dad, for example. My dad, I believe, is a very intelligent and capable man. And he became a mechanic. And I'd ask him, say, Dad, why are you a mechanic? Why didn't you become a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, etc.? And it turned out that he just didn't have that opportunity to do it. He didn't know much about it, and he was unable to get into those professions in life. And then a second life experience that I'll share as well. When growing up again, my mom would talk about their experiences. And one of the experiences was she was thirsty and she wanted to buy a Coke, but she was unable to do that in a cafe. She had to go through a side entrance because people of mixed race were not allowed to enter the main cafe. And I thought, wow, that's very, very odd. And I think I'll add a positive spin to that is, growing up in my life, I always thought, I entered internal audit and I always thought, I could never be a head of audit in a company. It's just, I don't have the experience, the background, the education. I don't talk a certain way. And lo and behold, I became head of audit at Lloyd's of London, which is something I never thought in my wildest dreams I could achieve. And likewise, I've been a head of audit at Catlin, and I am the head of audit at Convex. So I think that the reason I share that is to say that, I think in many ways we've come a long way. I think by virtue of the fact that we're talking about these things, what more should the insurance sector do? I think we need to continually talk about the experiences that people like myself, Black people, have. I think it helps people understand why somebody may feel a certain way and why they may act and behave in a certain way. Because without a deep understanding of those feelings and emotions, somebody may not necessarily understand why you're acting or why you're feeling and why you're behaving that way. So I find that's conversation and understanding is such a powerful tool. And it will help us, I think, David, you mentioned, is keep the momentum going. And I think that is important. Is it going to change overnight? Probably not. But are we on the trajectory of change? 100%, I believe we are. So I would say let's keep it going.
Great, thanks. And now to you, Marcia.
My response, I think, is probably more of a pipe dream. It's something that I really wish could happen. I think the insurance market as a whole, to what they could do to atone, would be to globally, as a collective, lobby for the reparation of the families or communities of those families who were enslaved. Mm-hmm. I think it's well known that the proceeds of slavery have been benefited from the insurance company in some way, shape, or form. And I also read recently, it was really interesting actually, that the systemic poverty that remains in the Caribbean can to this day be directly traced to the era of enslavement and colonialism. And at the end of that era, Britain walked away, leaving 60% of those regions, of those Black inhabitants within those regions, functionally illiterate. Therefore, that has a direct contribution and an impact on the poverty which we are seeing today. And I think that really shocked, well, it didn't shock me, but it just really made me open my eyes. The insurance market provided funding to slave owners, and therefore the insurance market should contribute to giving back to what they profited from. There's £30 million in today's money that was paid to slave owners for due to the loss of them when slavery was abolished. And unbelievably, those payments were still being made up to 5 years ago. So I think as a global collective, if that's something that insurance companies could get together and lobby towards a reparation, that would be fantastic. I start off by saying it's a pipe dream. It's something that maybe it could happen.
Well, I think that a lot of things that start off as a pipe dream are come into reality. And as David said at the beginning, if you'd have said in 2020 X, Y, and Z would be happening, we wouldn't have believed it. So let's have hope. And I will go to you, David, in a minute, just to kind of like respond to that question. But I just want to say right there in your response, Marcia, that is huge courage. Do you know what I mean? That's a big statement to make and that you've made. So thank you for sharing that. And I just think that there's some ownership that we as people living here right now need to take about educating and stating an ambition and wanting to contribute towards that. And just like Chris has done, I want to share one really, really quick experience. Following the death of George Floyd, I put a post out on social media just saying, I'm really devastated, I'm sad. My white friends and colleagues if you want to come and get educated or learn something, come talk to me. I have black friends and colleagues. If you want a space to speak, then come and talk to me. I told my parents about that. Their first response was, is your job going to be okay? That's what they said. They were so worried because they would never have been able to say that. So to Chris's point, I think we've come a long way. We need to keep coming a long way. And, you know, your pipe dream may in fact come into reality. David, would you like to respond to that question or some of the reactions that you've heard already?
Well, discussions about reparations seem to be only ever problematic when the people who would receive them are black. Reparations are entirely normal. Slavery ended with a form of reparations. Compensation paid to the 47,000 slave owners who owned 800,000 people at the end of slavery was agreed by Parliament. An act of Parliament was passed. A structure, an infrastructure, a bureaucracy was put in place to pay out the money. At the end of the First World War, Germany paid reparations to France. At the end of the Second World War, Germany paid reparations to Israel. It's restorative justice. Reparations payments are an entirely normal part of history, and they've worked the other way around as well, because when the people of Haiti rebelled against French slavery and freed themselves, 2 decades later in the 1820s, the French went back with 25 gunboats, battleships, and aimed 500 guns at the people of Haiti and demanded that they paid reparations for their own freedom. And Haiti paid those reparations until the 1980s. There's a movement at the moment in France to have France return some of that money that it intimidated, literally at the point of a gun, from one of the poorest countries in the world, which has remained one of the poorest countries in the world because of the money that's been extracted from it, from France. They've asked people to pay for the liberation of their great-great-grandparents. Reparations only seem to be a problem when the idea is that some of the money, some of the restorative facilities, some of the programs would benefit black people. Then it's controversial. Then it's a crazy idea. Then it's some ludicrous concept. It's entirely normal function of history. It's happened time and time again throughout history. So I think we need to understand the reparations movement in the context of history. You know, and as Marcia said, I mean, you know, Jamaica has one of the highest education and literacy rates in the world. There's an educational miracle taking place with very little resources in Jamaica, and that is entirely down to Jamaica. My white auntie went to Jamaica in the 1960s. She went there because she was a headmistress in London, and there was a charity desperately trying to find people who would go to Jamaica and teach and help, you know, create new schools and new cultures, because Britain had left in 1960, having never built a university in the Caribbean, with half the kids in Jamaica unable to read, in schools in shacks. Because the moment Jamaica and islands like it stopped being profitable, the British just lost interest. They warehoused those people there for generations. One of the strongest traditions in Jamaica is going abroad for labor, because the other strong tradition is poverty. Poverty caused by utter lack of investment and interest. And yet we are told constantly the empire was a force for good in the world. The empire was paternalistic. The empire looked after people. The empire made you a citizen. It built railways. Didn't build a damn thing in Jamaica. Reparations are justified not just for slavery, but for the neglect of slavery, and because those systems of slavery and empire left in its wake the idea we've been talking about today, the race idea.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we've got a few minutes left and we're on to our last question. Since the death of George Floyd, there's been sweeping reassessment of history of racism. So David talked about this a little earlier in his keynote address with regards to protesters tearing down the slave trader Edward Colston statue in the middle of Bristol and throwing it into the harbour. We've had comments from the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, around what should be the process to have those discussions. What do we actually think as a group of those sorts of statues? Are actions like tearing those statues down, are they simply not seeking to rewrite a difficult past? What's the right way? What's the wrong way? What should we do? What are our views on that? Chris, let me come back to you again.
Okay, thank you, Rose. So I think at the heart of this question is, should we apply today's values to the past? Is pretty much at the heart of this. And I think, unfortunately, history is history. It can never be rewritten. And I think from my perspective, what is important is that we don't erase it, but we learn from our history. I think contextualizing what's behind those statues and having a debate, it's all about people. I think society as a whole has changed. Our values, our norms are very different in many ways, I should hope, to the way they were in the past. And I think by educating, especially the young people, understanding the history behind the statues, and then deciding what is the best way where's the best place to have these statues? Should they be publicly displayed? Should they be put in a museum? Should they have plaques on it, so that future generations can really understand this is where we've come from, this is the past we have. How do we not repeat history? How do we create a better society? I think there's very powerful lessons to be learned on past human behavior, and it helps us shape the future. So my view is I don't believe we should tear down statues, because I think that in itself may not be a solution. And I think there's a much more constructive way that will bring everyone on side, and you can find out you'll get to a much better space in that regard. So that would be my view, at least.
Cool. Thanks for sharing your view, Chris. Marcia, what are your thoughts on this?
Mine are actually different to Chris's. In my view, I think removing statues and artifacts, I don't think they are an attempt to rewrite the past. I think it's recognizing that having a monumental figure or an artifact on display is honoring that person, in my view, irrespective of the pain and the hurt that individual may have caused. I've always felt that a statue is erected as a mark of respect or admiration for someone who has done something different or impactful, or really made a difference in people's lives. And I guess we would need to ask the question: would we erect a statue or give an MBE, for example, to a do-gooder if we knew that their generosity was funded by the proceeds of them being a drug dealer or a human trafficker? Now, whilst Edward Colson's name is associated with doing great stuff and donating to the poor, his wealth and those donations came from his involvement in the slave trade. So why there is such an uproar following the toppling down of his statue, I don't really understand. Unless, of course, Black people's lives who were obviously affected by this gentleman are seen as not being important.
Yeah. And I think also what we know is, or what we may know, some people may know, is people lobby for the removal of those statues for a long time before that one got ripped down in Bristol, right? But it was just closed down. So how do we open up those channels? But obviously we want to hear David's view on that. But the thing that I found fascinating about that incident that happened in Bristol was I saw 3 pairs of white hands and 1 pair of black hands on the rope that was pulling that statue down. And I saw Black and white people rolling that statue down the street in Bristol and throwing it into the water. And it was reported as protesters pulling down this statue. I question if it was 4 pairs of black hands and a whole bunch of Black people rolling that statue through, would it have been rioters pulling that statue? And, how do we incite that language and that sentiment to Black people around that? So I remember walking away from the TV watching that thinking, the storytelling of this is also just as important as, or it has value to what actually happened. But let's get back to the history. David, what's your view? You touched on it in your keynote around the statue. What's the best way forward?
Statues have nothing to do with history. They don't tell us history. We don't learn from history. They don't represent the values of the time. Edward Colson's statue was erected in 1895. He died in 1721. Many of these men were hated at the time. Cecil Rhodes is one of the hated men of his age. He doesn't represent the ideology of the 1890s. He was opposed in Britain, which is the reason he didn't get his hands on Botswana. There's huge opposition to these figures at the time. It's got nothing to do with history. It's about memorialization. The elite of 1890s Bristol decided to use the figure of Edward Colston to perpetuate their dominance of a small religious elite. They've got nothing to do with history. They don't teach us anything of history. It's a way of rewriting history. It's a way of taking the values of a different time, the 1890s in this case, and using someone from another period to support a hidden agenda. Most of these histories the statues have histories, but they're not the histories that the statues represent. The statues of the Confederate generals, they said nothing about the 1860s because they were built in the 1910s or in the 1960s. They do represent a history, just not the history that they physically embody. It's a lie. That's not what their function. Their function is, in the case of the Confederate journalists, to intimidate black people. In the case of Edward Colston, it's to express the power of a small group of elite merchants and religious bigots.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And it belongs in museums, because a statue on the street on a pedestal is a way of validation. It says, we in the 21st century value this person. To leave it on the street is to say, we're okay with this. Edward Colston was the deputy governor of the Royal African Company. In his time, that company, in the time he was involved, transported 80,000 people into slavery, and we think 19,000 people died. He was involved in an act of mass murder. To leave his statue up is to say we validate and are okay with this man who committed a crime, a terrible crime.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's an appropriate place to leave this discussion. I think I'm really pleased that we just spent some time and didn't try and cram anything else in there. I feel I've had an education. I feel that I've been inspired not to just think differently, but to do differently and be differently. And that's from everyone on the panel. So Chris, David and Marcia, thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your bravery of sharing some of these stories. I'm sure on behalf of ICANN, Convex and your audience, we're really grateful for the time you've allocated. I think we've got the results of the poll that are going to get flashed up. And I'm also going to hand back to Gabriel as well, if I may. But have we got... Is someone going to talk us through the, oh, sorry, I thought someone was going to talk us through those results.
So yeah, I think I've got the results on the screen now, which you should be able to see. So the question was, Britain's ethnic minorities have significant purchasing power in the range of, and then you were given three options, 160 billion, 10 billion, or 300 billion. And so yeah, we see people generally go for the middle of the range, but it's actually 300 billion, which is an enormous amount.
Okay, great, thank you. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you. Listen, first I want to say to all our panelists, thank you so much for your time today. I've learned so much. David, I don't want to signal anyone out, but David, that was extremely powerful. There's so many things that I'm going to watch this again and take some quotes, because there's so much. Being able to articulate the argument is also part of the journey as well, and having the fact to back your statement and your passion. So thank you so much for that. Marcia, Chris and Rose as well, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your stories. And I'm pretty sure everyone else on the call as well really appreciates that. Just want to mention a few things are going to be coming up, well, something that's going to be coming over in the last few weeks of November. We're going to be having a Black exhibition, a history timeline, which will come at you confirm of the dates. But we want you to look on our website and look out for social media where we'll be promoting it and how you can get involved. We've also got a new website out, which obviously we'd like you to have a look at. Any questions from today or anything that you would like to share with us, please come on the website and share with us. We're only going to get better and only going to get smarter if you can share with us and learn from yourselves. For myself personally, I've honestly recently just joined ICANN as a BLM lead. I'm really would like to hear from everybody, find out what's going on. Like I always say, BLM is quite new to us and quite new to the industry. So we're only going to learn together. So please get in contact with us and just find out how we can collaborate. And other than that, I just wanted to say thank you very much everyone for joining. Again, look out for social media. And hopefully we will see each other soon on the next ICANN event. Thank you very much.